In the bustling city of Mendoza, Argentina, residents were no strangers to strange sights. But when a car screeched down the high street with an alarming sight, people froze in horror. As they realized what was happening, shock turned to action, and people scrambled to protect a defenseless animal caught in a cruel act. Argentina has long struggled with a large population of street dogs. Thankfully, many private organizations work tirelessly to protect these animals. Still, there are always a few who view them as nothing more than nuisances. Sofia, a busy teacher with little love for animals, had recently noticed a large brown dog lingering near her home. Initially, the dog looked skinny and worn, as street dogs often do, but over the past few weeks, it had begun looking healthier. Despite the dog's improved state, Sofia found its presence irritating. Her schedule was already packed, and caring for a pet was the last thing she wanted. She tried shooing the dog away, but it always seemed to reappear when she pulled into her parking spot. Unbeknownst to her, the dog's presence was due to her husband's quiet kindness. But Sofia didn't know this and grew increasingly annoyed. One particularly exhausting day, she arrived home to find the dog waiting by her front door. Frustration simmered within her. She wasn't interested in having any animal near her home, especially not a street dog. The frustrated woman chased the dog away, even tossing a small stone in its direction to scare it off. Thankfully, she missed. Slamming the door behind her, Sofia threw down her bags, kicking off her shoes with a huff. Her husband, Caleb, came to see what was wrong, only to be met with a heated rant about the street dog lingering around the house. Sofia's anger flared when Caleb simply smiled, revealing that he'd been the one feeding the dog. Unlike Sofia, Caleb was gentle and easygoing. Their marriage had long puzzled friends, who saw Sofia's cold, dismissive attitude toward him. Lately, Caleb himself had begun to wonder if he still loved her. He tried for years, believing he could manage her harsh temperament, but now he found himself doubting their future together. Her overreaction to the dog only deepened his uncertainty. 2 months earlier, Caleb had first noticed the dog, thin and forlorn at the edge of their garden. His heart ached for the big, gentle creature, and he'd given it some leftovers from the fridge. The dog was hesitant, but eventually ate once Caleb stepped back inside. From that day on, he left food out regularly, and over time, the dog grew more comfortable, even allowing Caleb to pet him. Though the dog was large, Caleb quickly recognized him as a gentle giant. As his marriage continued to crumble, Caleb found comfort in these quiet moments with the dog. To anyone watching, it might seem like Caleb was the one helping the dog, but in truth, the dog was offering him the solace and companionship he desperately needed. Caleb knew he could never tell Sofia that he'd been feeding a street dog. She disliked pets, and her disdain for Mendoza's many stray dogs was well known to him. But now that the dog was hanging around frequently, she was beginning to notice. Part of Caleb wished he'd just admitted his actions. Maybe it would have eased her anger. But after 6 years of marriage, he should have known better. When Sofia realized Caleb had been caring for the dog, she was livid. He tried reassuring her, explaining that the dog had never been inside the house and that she didn't have to interact with it. But Sofia refused to listen, her frustration boiling over as she warned him that if she saw the dog again, she wouldn't be responsible for her actions. Caleb was stunned. He knew Sofia's temper, but he couldn't believe she'd actually harm an innocent animal, would she? The thought was disturbing, and he found himself torn. If he stopped feeding the dog, it would likely end up in the same poor condition as when he first found it, thin and struggling. The dog had become a source of quiet happiness for Caleb, the only light in his otherwise strained life, and he couldn't bear to see it suffer. Determined, Caleb decided he wouldn't let Sofia's threats scare him away from doing what felt right. He resolved to continue caring for the dog, even if it meant being careful. He would ensure the dog was well out of sight whenever Sofia was around, feeding and caring for it in secret. Caleb knew he'd reached a point where he could no longer be controlled by his wife's anger. He had found a connection in this gentle creature, and he would protect it no matter what. For a few weeks, Caleb's plan worked smoothly. Since he worked from home, he could change up the feeding times to make sure the dog wasn't around when Sophia returned. Fortunately, her schedule was regular, and she arrived home around the same time each day. But as days passed, a new challenge emerged. The dog had grown attached to Caleb and was now reluctant to leave the area. The dog had become friendly, greeting Caleb each day with a happy wag and a playful flop for belly rubs. Caleb was thrilled by the bond they'd formed. He loved that the dog trusted him. But a persistent worry nagged at him. If Sophia discovered their secret, she might take drastic action. Deep down, he feared that her resentment of the dog might lead to something terrible. Meanwhile, Sophia's day took a turn for the worse. She'd stormed out of work after a clash with her manager over her harsh demeanor. In her mind, it was never her fault. There was always someone else to blame. Fuming, she threw her bag into the car and sank into the driver's seat, punching the steering wheel in frustration. Her mind turned to that stray dog. The thought of it lingering around her house only added fuel to her anger, and she swore that if she saw it again, there would be hell to pay. Sophia had suspected for a while that Caleb was still feeding the dog, even though it always seemed to disappear before she got home. She was tired of his kindness toward the stray and decided it was time to make her own plans. With a growing sense of determination, she drove to a nearby pet store, bought a leash, and stuffed it into her glove compartment, convinced she'd need it soon. In her mind, it was only a matter of time before she put a stop to Caleb's nonsense and get rid of the dog once and for all. She had no idea just how soon that moment would arrive. When Sophia arrived home, she wasn't sure if she was relieved or annoyed to see the dog wasn't in sight. Caleb, who was usually cleaning or cooking to win her favor, was also nowhere to be found. But as she entered the kitchen, she spotted him outside in the garden, playing with none other than the mangy street dog. Her irritation flared as she watched the dog roll around happily in front of him, the two completely unaware of her presence. As she continued to watch, the dog casually lifted his leg and relieved himself on her prized flower bed. That was the final straw. Any plan to deal with the dog later quickly vanished. She would take care of it now. She grabbed the leash from her car, her mind set on teaching her husband and that dog a lesson they wouldn't forget. Sophia stormed around to the back garden, her expression hard and determined. Caleb looked up, surprised, and immediately checked his watch, realizing with dread that he'd lost track of time. He'd been enjoying the dog's company so much that he hadn't noticed how late it was. But what puzzled him most was the sight of his wife holding a leash. Before Caleb could say a word, Sophia looped the leash around the dog's neck and yanked it roughly. Startled, Caleb tried to get to his feet, but his leg had fallen asleep from sitting too long. By the time he managed to stand, he felt his stomach churn at the scene unfolding in front of him. Sophia had tied the dog to the back of her car, her hand reaching for the ignition. Caleb's mind reeled with disbelief. Could his wife really be planning to drive off with the dog tied to her vehicle? He couldn't fathom how someone could be so cruel. Caleb's heart shattered as Sophia's car sped off, the poor dog forced to run, leashed to the back. Desperate, he shouted, but it was too late. In a panic, Caleb grabbed his car keys and jumped into his own vehicle, racing after her down the street. By then, Sophia had reached the high street, tearing down the road with blind rage, her grip on the steering wheel firm, her mind clouded with anger. She didn't once look back at the dog, indifferent to its suffering, determined to make a cruel point. People on the street, horrified at the scene, began shouting, some trying to flag her down, others capturing the incident on their phones, hoping the footage might later aid the police. But Sophia ignored it all, only pressing harder on the gas. As Caleb raced to catch up, he took a quick turn down a side street, hoping to intercept her on the other end of the high street. Luck was on his side. As he turned back onto the main road, he spotted her speeding toward him, the dog barely able to keep pace, stumbling and clearly struggling. Caleb pulled his car across the road, blocking her path. For a heart-stopping moment, he feared she wouldn't stop, but at the last second, Sophia's car screeched to a halt just inches from his door. Without wasting a moment, Caleb leaped out of his car, rushing to the back of Sophia's vehicle. There, lying on the ground, was the exhausted dog. To Caleb's immense relief, he was still breathing, though clearly worn and injured. Gently, Caleb removed the leash from around his neck, lifting the dog's head onto his lap, his own eyes filling with tears. Despite all it had endured, the dog looked up at Caleb, offering a faint wag of its tail, grateful to see the one person who had shown it kindness. In that moment, Caleb felt an overwhelming surge of love and gratitude for the loyal animal. The gentle giant had suffered unspeakably, yet he still trusted Caleb, still wanted to be by his side. Sitting there in the middle of the road, with bystanders gathering around, Caleb held the dog close, vowing to protect him from that moment forward. Caleb's heart broke at the sight of the injured dog's unwavering loyalty. He couldn't help but blame himself for not taking his wife's threats seriously or watching the time more closely. Now, this gentle creature had suffered because of his wife's cruel actions. Thankfully, though, Sophia was about to face the consequences of her appalling behavior. When the police arrived on the scene, they were met by a gathering of shocked onlookers and several witnesses who had captured the events on their phones. These videos documented the full extent of Sophia's actions, leaving little room for her to argue or justify what she had done. Sophia was quickly placed under arrest and taken to the station for questioning, facing charges of reckless driving, animal cruelty, and endangerment. When the officers asked why she'd done it, her only response was that she had been teaching the dog a lesson. Her cold and indifferent demeanor only fueled the community's outrage. Meanwhile, amidst the chaos, a local veterinarian who had been in the area and witnessed the entire ordeal approached Caleb and offered to take the injured dog back to his clinic for emergency treatment. Caleb was overwhelmed with gratitude, fighting back tears as he helped carry the dog into the vet's vehicle. As they drove, Caleb's mind raced with worry for his friend, mixed with a newfound clarity about his own life. If the dog survived, he promised himself, he would finally take the steps he'd been avoiding. He would divorce Sophia, end their toxic relationship, and dedicate himself to giving this loyal dog the safe, loving home he deserved. Upon arrival at the clinic, the vet quickly set to work, carefully cleaning the dog's wounds and examining him for broken bones. Caleb stood nearby, heart pounding, feeling both fear and hope. Each time the dog looked up at him, his tail would wag slightly, a gentle reminder of his resilience and forgiveness. Despite all he had endured, the dog held no resentment, only affection and gratitude, as if assuring Caleb that everything would be all right. After a thorough examination, the vet delivered news that felt like a miracle. While the dog's injuries were serious, they were not life-threatening, and with proper care, he would recover fully. Relief washed over Caleb as tears finally slipped down his cheeks. He had feared the worst, but was now filled with gratitude for this second chance with his loyal companion. As Sophia's case moved to trial, the footage from witnesses and the testimonies from those who had seen her actions firsthand played a central role in securing her conviction. The community's outrage was palpable and justice was swift. Sophia was sentenced to prison for her actions, with her callous attitude in court doing nothing to lessen her punishment. Before the trial even concluded, her teaching job was terminated. The school made it clear they wanted nothing to do with someone capable of such cruelty. During her first weeks in prison, Sophia received little to no communication from the outside world. Her only correspondence was a set of divorce papers from Caleb. In his heart, Caleb knew he had made the right choice. For too long, he had endured her toxic behavior, holding on to hope that things would improve, but this event had shattered any illusions he might have had about their future together. He no longer felt guilt or responsibility for her actions. His only regret was not leaving sooner. Now, he looked forward to building a new life, one filled with kindness, companionship, and love, both for himself and his newly adopted friend. Caleb brought his new companion home, naming him Courage in honor of the dog's resilience and his own newfound strength. Courage quickly settled into a life filled with the love and care he had always deserved. Caleb took him on long walks, showered him with belly rubs and treats, and ensured he had a warm bed and a full belly. The companionship brought joy and fulfillment to both of them, transforming Caleb's once lonely life. As Courage's physical wounds healed, it was clear his heart had been mended by Caleb's kindness. Their days fell into a comforting routine of dawn walks, sunny afternoons, and cozy evenings with Courage resting his head on Caleb's lap, a friendship built on trust and love. Their story spread through the town, and neighbors, horrified by Sophia's cruelty, came by with treats and toys, embracing the bond Caleb and Courage shared. Together, Caleb and Courage found solace, happiness, and a new family in each other. Their journey became a powerful testament to love, loyalty, and the healing that true friendship can bring.